All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning. We're going through our daily Bible reading. We have had a fantastic weekend. This is the first day of the new week, and so thankful for Dan and Angie being here with us. We were able to worship God together Friday night, and Dan launched into his a series of lessons about what we were going to do yesterday, and yesterday was fantastic. And I would really encourage everyone, if you weren't here for the series of lessons that Dan Estes presented to us, to really help us to launch into this theme, being steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. I highly encourage you to go back and take a listen. They're really encouraging and also convicting. We all have to make decisions about who we're going to be and what we're going to do. So we have one more lesson this morning. Looking forward to Dan preaching to us today. We're actually going to have our Bible class, our daily Bible reading class, and so we're in the book of Genesis. I know it's very cold outside, so thank you for being here. If you guys are into the ice bath therapy, you didn't have to do that this morning. You can just walk outside, and there it is right there all for you. So let's begin with a prayer, and then we're going to dive into our daily Bible reading. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for today. We're thankful, Father, for this family that meets here. We pray, Heavenly Father, that you will help us to be steadfast and immovable, to continue to be zealous for good deeds and to abound in the work of the Lord, remembering that our labor is not in vain. We are reminded in the book of Genesis of your great love and your steadfastness, your faithfulness, and your integrity. Help us, God, to remove any idols that we may have in our lives and our hearts that are hindering us from walking with you and the fellowship that we have with you. Help us, Father, to encourage one another, and thank you for the precious promises that have been recorded and that we can know who you are. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right, let's quote our Bible memory verse from Genesis chapter 1, verse number 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That one verse tells us so much, right? In the beginning, there's a marked beginning of time, of space, of matter that God created. And he is outside of time, space, and matter. We see the sovereignty of God. We see the power of God. And we see that he is the one that created all things. So one of the things that we're doing in this daily Bible reading, we don't have a workbook. The text is going to be our workbook. One of the things we want to encourage is to ask questions. And so I appreciate the question last week pertaining to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17. I do want to begin our class just answering a couple of more questions that I did receive. I don't want to wait to the end of class to do that and kind of feel rushed doing that. And if you have questions along the way today, then feel free to ask them as well in class. One of the questions goes back to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 3, so go back there real quickly here. And what I'm also doing, and if you want a copy of this, I'll give you a copy of it. I have a Word document, and the questions that I get, I'm putting them in that Word document, and I'm going to put a question, and then I'll put my answer. If you want to have that document for your record, you are more than welcome. So first, another question I got was Genesis 6, verse number 3. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years." And the question was really dealing with what is this idea of 120 years. So there's really, I think, only two possibilities, and I'll tell you what I believe to be true. The first is 120 years is talking about how long mankind would live. So we do see in the book of Genesis that men begin living shorter and shorter lives. If you go back to chapter 5, people are living 600, 700, 800, 900 years. The second possibility, which is what I shared with a brother who asked me this question, is that I think this 120 years is pointing to the time of when the flood would begin, the time of when judgment would begin, where God would destroy the entire earth with a worldwide flood. We know that Abraham's going to live 175 when we get to Genesis chapter 25. We know that Noah lived 950 years as well. And so those are the two possibilities, but I think that 120 is really pointing to when the flood would begin. And so any comments or questions, any other perspectives with that? Yeah.
I think what's confusing, maybe for me, is because it's not immediate. You see like a decrease, it's like a slow, but it does end up being 100, a bit much lower over 20 years.
Yeah. So there is, it's not immediate, and that's why I tend to think it's not just saying, okay, this is how long people, people are not going to live past that. You do have other passages, I think, in Psalm 90 and verse number 10 that speak about age and life. In Psalm 90 and verse 10, as for the days of our life, they contain 70 years. Or if due to strength, 80 years. That's not an absolute, because people live longer than 80 years old as well. And there have been people even in our generations who have lived over 100 years. So that's why I think it's pertaining more to when the flood would begin, and this idea of impending judgment with the flood. The second question, any other comments with that? The second question then takes us to Genesis chapter 25, which is a part of our reading discussion for this week as well. As we get into our reading, and we'll do another overview here in just a moment, we're really going to look at the life of Abraham. Really exciting, really looking at a journey of faith with Abraham and Sarah. So in Genesis chapter 25, Sarah has died, and in verse number 1 of chapter 25, it says, "Now Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah, and she would bear children to Abraham," in verses 2 and 3 and 4. In verse number 5, it says, "Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east." So the question is here, Keturah is referred to as his wife, Abraham's wife, in verse number 1. And then in verse number 6, she seems to be grouped in with Abraham's concubines. We know that Hagar would have been a concubine of Abraham, going back to Genesis chapter 15 as well. So how do we understand this idea where in one place she's referred to as his wife, and then in the next place she's referred to as a concubine? We have a couple of thoughts to consider. The first is in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, if you want to turn over there. In 1 Chronicles chapter 1, we have some commentary on Keturah. 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse number 32. This is a rehearsal of Abraham and the generations of Abraham. Verse 28 talks about Isaac and Ishmael. And then in verse number 32, it says, "The sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine." So Chronicles gives us a little different commentary that Keturah was a concubine of Abraham, or for Abraham. So how do we handle this distinction here? Well, it may have been that Moses, and we have to remember that Moses wrote Genesis, and remember the audience that he's writing to. He's writing to the Israelites who have come out of Egypt, as Miles is going to take us through. It may have been that Moses, who wrote Genesis, is making a distinction between Sarah and Keturah, since the child of promise would come from Sarah. We know there's a bigger emphasis upon Sarah. When you think about 1 Peter chapter 3, Sarah is the one who's mentioned, not Hagar, not Keturah, with respect to this relationship with Abraham. We know from Hebrews chapter 11, Sarah is emphasized as well. And so it could be that Keturah had been a concubine while Sarah was still alive. That's another possibility as well. Sometimes we don't have every single detail in chronological order. If you look in Genesis chapter 25, at verse number 7, for example, we see that Abraham, he lived 175 years. In Genesis 25 and verse number 7. He lived 175 years. And then it says, Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man, and satisfied with life, and he was gathered to his people. Then we read the story of Isaac and Rebekah having Jacob and Esau. Now, here's what's interesting here. How old was Abraham when he had Isaac? He was 100, right? He was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. So Abraham lived to be 175 in verse 7. In the same chapter, when you continue on, we get some additional details. Look at verse 26 about the age of Isaac. Afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding unto Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to him. So Isaac is 60. Abraham lived to be 175, so Abraham was still alive when Jacob and Esau were born. And so it could have just been that Keturah was a concubine while Sarah was still alive. And we have that detail, and then she became his wife after the death of Sarah. And it could just be a clear distinction between the importance of Sarah versus Keturah. So it is an interesting question. Another question to think about here is, why is Keturah even mentioned? Why is she even mentioned in this whole account? Because she is not the one from which the promise of the Messiah is going to come from. And that's something to think about as you read Genesis and throughout the Old Testament. There's a promise, there's a story that's being told. What were some of the promises God told Abraham back in Genesis 12? I've shared the three big promises, right? Some of the other promises, your name is going to be great. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. You're going to be blessed. You're going to be a father of many people or many nations. And I think that may be why Keturah and the information that we have here concerning Keturah is even shared with us. We still see God blessing Abraham, and we see that indeed he is going to be the father of many nations. Yeah, Mouse?
I also noticed, as we were reading from 1 Chronicles 1, in verse 32, the sons of one of Keturah's sons is Midian, and the Midianites are also going to play. You mentioned that Moses writes this, so the Midianites are also going to play a role in the Exodus story. So that might be another reason that Keturah specifically would be, and her descendants would be relevant to the Israel.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, you think about how her children or the descendants from Keturah, how do they play in this story of Israel, right, as they become a nation? So yeah, that's a great point. So to answer the question, I would say yes, she was a concubine of Abraham, and she may have been elevated after the death of Sarah to be his wife, and that's why she's described in that way. But there is a clear distinction, I believe, between Keturah and Sarah all throughout the book of Genesis. Any comments or other additional questions? So if you have more questions, let me just stop right here before we dive into some thoughts. And you may have some questions during the class. Does anyone have any questions from what we read this past week? From Genesis chapters 18 through 31. Any questions that you guys want to talk about? I know it's cold outside, but maybe you're warming up a little bit. And, there's a lot of information in these chapters. It's a lot to go through. No questions. This is good. Oh, there is a question. All right, let's go.
In chapter 31, verse 53, it says, "The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judged between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac." And in my Bible, it has fear capitalized there. I've never seen God referenced as capitalized with fear, so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what that.
That is a great question. Let me write it down. So Genesis 31 and verse number 53, where Elena is mentioning here. What translation are you reading from? The ESV?
So I don't know if it's just a translation thing or...
Yeah. I'm not really for sure. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Mine is not uppercase either. Sometimes that is done by translators, to emphasize something. But that's a great question. I'm not really for sure. But certainly, again, we do see this promise being, reaffirmed, and Jacob understands who God is. But let me do some more reading on that, and I'll get back to you. Troy.
I read from the ESV too, and it actually uses it in verse 42 as well. And the often helpful but uninspired study notes at the bottom, it says that the author says is clearly a substitute for God. I mean, that kind of makes sense, that we're to fear the name of God, or to fear God and keep His commandments, and other references like that, depending on the translation.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense to, if you read that, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Thank you both for that. That's something good to go back and look at. Yeah. Any other questions? That's a good one. Yeah, Tanya?
piggybacking on what they were saying, I noticed that too and didn't understand, but it possibly could be just the fear that Isaac had of God for certain things he was to follow, whether it was who he married or where he was supposed to go, and so maybe that could have been a reference for fear, just in terms of what his father had done and what he obeyed, that he was following in those same footsteps. Because that whole story with Jacob and Laban and the trickery with, Rebecca and her sons and then all of that, I don't know, some of that could have tied in. And Isaac was given specific instructions like, don't marry certain people. You see that Esau kind of did the opposite just to be petty.
Yeah.
But so it could have been maybe a mixture of that. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that observation as well. It's a great question, great thought. Any other questions or observations? There's something to be said about reading multiple translations. Yeah.
I think it's interesting as we read this history to see how it plays out. Of course, we have the story completely written and we can see all of it, but to see God's will flowing through it, but he allows man to make decisions on his own. He has his own will.
Yeah.
We see Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, they all lie about things. And that's recorded for us. But I just think it's interesting to see that God allows man's will. And at some point, there will be consequences for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an important theme to think about going through the free will that mankind has, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And again, seeing the deceitfulness of men, even the half lies are still lies with what Abraham did, and there was premeditation with those things as well, right? So it wasn't just like motive. Yeah, that's exactly right. It wasn't spur of the moment type stuff. No, this is really thought out by Abraham, and we see that with Isaac, and we see that with Jacob. And so it's interesting how a lot of those things happen. But certainly that's something important where we see this journey of faith, and faith has to have choice. And that's what Abraham's doing. He's making the choice to leave his homeland. He's making the choice to travel without knowing where he's going to go. That's a great observation, yeah. Any other questions, yeah, or comments?
In Genesis 19, when Lot goes to Zoar, and he's told he'll be safe there, that city will not be destroyed, he then leaves that city and goes in the mountains. And we were talking yesterday about decisions and things that we have to choose that are wise and trust God. To me, it seemed as though he might have not trusted God to say, I'm not going to destroy that city. He had just seen, or he had just heard from behind the destruction. I'm sure he saw it afterwards. But there were a lot of consequences for him to have gotten up by himself in loneliness, and his daughters outside of those in the city that they could have married, and other things. I just think his lack of trust and maybe fear might have put his family in a position of, temptation in some way. He got drunk and he accepted the fact he was drinking. And I don't know, it's just, I just thought it was kind of like what Richard was saying. People are making their choices.
Yeah.
And he made his choice based on his own fears.
Mm-hmm. Now, I agree with you, and I was thinking about Dan's lesson from yesterday as well, just reading this and going over it again. This goes back to Genesis 13, where Abraham and Lot are going to make a decision. Hey, what land do you want? And the decision that Lot makes, it's not part of this land of promise. It looks really good, but Sodom and Gomorrah is there. And if I'm remembering correctly, go back to chapter 13. There's no need for me to guess. Let me just take a look at the text here. In Genesis chapter 13, to add what Stephen's saying, in verse number 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. So Lot's decision from an early stage cost him a lot. It cost him his wife, sin, as you mentioned, with drunkenness, incest. There were other men out there. Just a lot of series of mistakes, but it started off with what he saw and what he was drawn to. And, he's with Abraham. And Abraham may have been thinking, how is this promise going to work out? Because you could adopt an heir, right? So I think that was Abraham's nephew, Lot. But, they go their separate ways. And so you're exactly right. He makes a lot of decisions that really hurt his family. And he makes a lot of decisions that, looking back, a lot of destruction came from it. And I have here from a commentary, the choice Lot made for his wealth and career cost him his wife, his body, laying with your own daughters. It cost him a lot, for going after something bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, I've often wondered why Lot stayed there.
Sodom.
Yeah. Back to the decisions we make. I may have a new career opportunity, and I don't investigate that close enough. Maybe there's not a sound congregation there where I can worship. That's going to affect me and my family. So we need to think through those things. And I often wonder, why did Lot stay there?
Mm-hmm. And what happened to Lot? Now we're on this discussion here in chapter 14. You guys remember? He gets kidnapped in these wars, and Abraham has to save him. So there's another opportunity, right? There's another opportunity for Lot to say, maybe I should rethink some of this. But he's taken up residence in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so you have Abraham, trying to intercede for him in chapter 18. I think it's interesting, too. I know this was part of last week, but in chapter 14 and verse 10, there were tar pits there in that valley, which I found that was interesting, too. And then it's going to be destroyed with this heat. So, yeah, there's a lot of decisions, poor decisions that he made, and there's some great application with that. Yeah, any other comments or thoughts? Yeah.
In Genesis 14, the story of Melchizedek would make 0% sense if we did not have the book of Hebrews. And then you factor in how much longer in time the book of Hebrews was written. Like, God's plan throughout this entire story, he's planting the seeds we need to understand. But if these pieces were not brought together, that very little section makes no sense.
Yeah.
Until Hebrews explains it to us.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you go back to the end of Genesis chapter 14, and one of the things I mentioned last week was that use the New Testament as a good commentary for this Bible reading, not just with Genesis, but the entire Old Testament. Melchizedek, he's described as king of Salem, and verse 18, priest of God Most High. He's going to be referenced as well in Psalm 110, in one of the Gospels, I think Matthew, where Jesus is arguing from Psalm 110. But then primarily in Hebrews, that's where we get all of this commentary, these types and antitypes, right, pointing to Christ. And so, yeah, just if you're just reading this, and maybe that's something interesting with the Bible as well, why we should read it from cover to cover. You have this progressive revelation where things are slowly being revealed, throughout centuries. And I think that points back to inspiration of the Scriptures. Yeah, excellent thought. Any other thoughts or comments, just with some observations? We'll dive into this. Yeah.
So, amongst all the disappointing stories, we have the story in Genesis 24 of how Abraham, when he was old, he sent a servant to search out a wife for Isaac.
Yeah.
And how that servant demonstrated great faith and confidence and prayed. But what's the most amazing to me is Rebecca's reaction. So just after what seemingly is a few days, she's introduced to the idea of, we have a mate for you, and the servant insists that they return after a short period of time, and she goes, along with all of her handmaidens. So just incredible faith and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
It's all going to work out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great example of certainly faith with Isaac and Rebekah, how Rebekah is going to respond. And there are good stories in here as well. There are some positive stories for us to learn from. And I think that's something we all need to be thinking about as we go through the reading. What are we learning about faith? This is all a journey of faith. And think about the first 11 chapters. We don't know exactly how much time, but if you estimate Genesis 1 through 11, we're talking, hundreds and hundreds, not thousands of years. And then Genesis 12 through 25 is 25 years. Everything slows down because we're just looking at the story of Abraham. He's 75. And I guess a little bit longer since he dies at 175, but for the most part, it's those 25 years. And then the rest of Genesis is just going to be a couple more generations. We have Isaac, we have Jacob, we have the emphasis upon Joseph. So the first 11 chapters are like this prelude. You have this, flag being, put down in Genesis chapter 12 with those three promises: the land promise, the nation promise, and the blessing promise, which really is something, that we're going to see. We have Abraham, 25 years before Isaac is going to be born. Jacob and Esau wrestling in the womb. They're both born. And then we start to see Jacob after he's married to Rachel and Leah. Leah and the handmaids they're going to begin the beginning of these tribes, or these children that are going to become a part of the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's something good to keep in mind, that there is a real slowing down as we get through the rest of the book of Genesis. So we didn't cover 12 through 17. 18 through 31, you guys read that. How would you summarize 18 through 31? And then I'll go over some additional thoughts that I have. How would you summarize 18 through 31, what you read this past week? Who wants to give it a shot?
It's really, it's really taking us through the next couple of generations and seeing the fulfillment of God's promise through Isaac, and how that would come about through his son Jacob and those sons, and really how God. It seems amazing to me to see God's hand in the work of the lives of these people, how they saw fit that they wouldn't intermarry with certain groups, and that Isaac would go back and marry Rebekah, and Jacob would go and end up marrying Leah and Rachel, and all of those intricacies, but really God's hand throughout that, and how he was able to fulfill his promise regardless of man's decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. If I were to ask you guys, and I made a list here, Abraham was a man of, how would you fill in the blank? Just think about what you've learned about Abraham from Genesis 12 through 25 with the reading. Abraham was a man of faith. What else? Is that it? Obedience. Abraham was a man of obedience. That goes hand in hand with his faith, right? We actually see the grace of God choosing Abraham, being gracious to him, Abraham walking by faith, and he's going to receive this promise, or his descendants will receive this promise, which is another example of God's grace. But we certainly see his obedience, and that gives us a good working definition of what faith looks like. Faith in action, right? So Abraham was a man of faith. He was a man of obedience. How else would you describe Abraham? Abraham was a man of what? Yeah.
He was also a man who found favor with God. After all, God did essentially crown him the father of all nations.
Yeah, so he found favor with God, certainly, and with other people too. I will bless those who bless you, right? Abraham was a man of what? What else? Abraham was a man of mistakes. That's right. The Holy Spirit doesn't hide any of those mistakes. We kind of talked about that a little bit, right? Where he had a lot of faults. Some of those were premeditated. And it seems like when we get to Genesis chapter 22, when he's going to be told to sacrifice his son Isaac, that may be really the apex of his faith. Now I know. Now I see, because a couple of things. One, aren't you thankful that God is patient toward us? And two, aren't you thankful we have this example of what faith and the journey looks like? It's not about perfection, is it? Because we see very early on a lot of flaws with the lying, with... Abraham was really good at... Abraham was a man of bargaining, right? He liked to bargain, right? What about Eliezer? Won't he work? What if there's only 50 that are righteous, or 45, or 40? But then by the time we get to Genesis chapter 22... when God tells him to sacrifice Isaac, is there any bargaining? There is none. All there is obedience. He gets up, he's walking by faith, and what did he believe about God to cause him to walk that way in faith? What did he believe about God to be true? He would keep his promise. He would live. He would live even if he died. He could raise the dead, right? And we see some of this like in Romans. But there is great confidence in Abraham. Alex, you said something. I cut you off. I'm sorry. Did you say something else? Oh, okay. I put Abraham was a man in progress. He was a man in progress. And I think that's something good for us to take away. He was a man with great promises. You guys have already mentioned the faults and the faith. Along his journey, what kind of legacy, not just for his own family, but other people, did he leave behind that people could tangibly see? He would go to a place.
He had courage. He would look out for his family.
Yeah.
And he was not a procrastinator.
That's exactly right. Isn't that interesting, Stephen? In Genesis 14, Lot's in trouble. I'm getting 318 men. There's another story in the Bible in Judges about a man with 300. Gideon. How much coaxing did that take for Gideon to get up? I don't know, man. I don't think we can do it. Abraham's like, get the men ready. We're going out, which is really impressive. That's right. But he was also a man full of, go ahead, Nicole.
Were you talking about like the altars?
Yes, that's what I was talking about. Yeah, the altars. He leaves behind this evidence of worship. He leaves behind this evidence of faith. And so, yeah, all of these things combined with the altars that he's leaving behind. He's also a man full of wealth. He's rich, and his possessions grow. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And he has a name of great character, great reputation, great fame as well. He was a man who questioned. But eventually, he would become a man who didn't question. And I think that's a good example of where our faith needs to get to. He was a man that questioned God a lot. And eventually, we talked about this in our breakout groups yesterday, he surrendered. He surrendered to the Lord. He just stopped asking questions, and he just was obedient. Dan?
Even though he was a man who didn't procrastinate, he was a man who eventually learned patience.
Yes.
And he had to learn to wait for God to fulfill his promise his way, after trying to do it his own way on God's behalf. So I think he eventually learned that. It was a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah, it was. And I think, Dan, that's one of the biggest lessons we see in the book of Genesis so far. God wants his people to get comfortable with delay. With delay. Even with the building of the ark, it's going to take a long time. There's delay. The years in Egyptian bond captivity, Genesis 15, they're going to be there a long time. There's delay. 25 years with Isaac, there's more delay. It's like everything is being delayed. Everything is just taking forever. But that's where our faith has to mature. So that's exactly right. Yeah, he would become a man of great patience as well. Any other thoughts? And we'll dive into some other things too about Abraham that stands out to you. Yeah, Troy.
One of the other things that maybe as a kid that I thought of, you study about Abraham and Isaac and all these big names. One of the other things to take away from this, like we mentioned with all the other qualities of Abraham, he was ordinary. He was just a man. He was not super duper mega anything. He was not Superman. He was not endowed with superpowers. He was a man. He lived and breathed and ate and sweated and all those kind of ordinary things.
Yeah.
And he was selected by God to do extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And we see the same thing throughout the New Testament, throughout all the rest of the Old Testament too. And it's the same thing God asks of us today. Is we don't have to be super duper mega with superpowers and all these other things. He knows that we're just people.
Right.
And he selects ordinary people to do extraordinary things all throughout the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. One second. Let me just make a comment here. That's a great point, Troy. Think about Genesis 11. What were the people trying to do in Shinar, which would eventually be Babylon? They're trying to make a name for themselves. We're going to make a great city. We're going to make a great tower. We're going to exalt our name. They're full of pride, and God destroys them. But then in the very next chapter, as you're saying, Troy, a man from Ur is called, and he's a nobody, so to speak, right? And who's going to lift him up? Not himself, but God is going to lift him up. God is going to put him in this status of great fame that men are trying to do on their own, and they can't do that without God. And so I think there's something there even about the timing of Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel and also the introduction to Abraham in chapter 12. Kyle?
Well, when I think about Abraham, I tend to think about Hebrews 11, verse 9, where it speaks about him dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob. And, mornings like today make that really significant. Having Abraham, live his entire life, and that's really the lifestyle. But in that chapter, it makes it clear that the comparison is between the tents he dwelt in and that permanent city that has foundations. And I think that's an attitude that we all really need to adopt, is we're really just living in tents. These bodies we inhabit, they're very temporary, just like the tents that Abraham dwelt in.
Yeah.
Not trust in those things.
Absolutely. Most people in Hebrews 11 get one verse. He gets 12. So there's something to be said here about this story, right? About his faith. Yeah, any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, a mouse?
Well, thinking about, him, Abraham living in tents his entire life, and then you just kind of made reference to Babel. It's just kind of interesting from a worldly perspective. Which do you think would make you more famous? Living in a tent your entire life, or building this incredible city, this incredible tower all by yourself? But the legacy of Babel is that's where all the foreign languages come from, and they got punished, and they kind of messed everything up for themselves. And obviously God didn't approve of that. But then Abraham's legacy is the father of all faithful, the father of all nations. He has this incredible legacy that isn't even based on the fact that he was rich or where he lived or where he came from. It was the way he walked with God.
Yeah.
Obviously it relates to things he did, but it wasn't like
Sure.
in a resume type of sense,
Right.
but in a
He's not actively trying to do this on his own. Hey, let me build this up so people can know me. And I think that's a good point, or a point for us to remember. Look over in Joshua chapter 24. Zach, have no fear. Just a couple of verses here, bro. Oh, Audrey, you got a question? Oh, who else? Who am I missing? Oh, go ahead, brother.
The relationship between God and Abraham is being friends.
Yeah.
How do you get that close relationship with God that God are considered friends? I think
Yeah.
it's very interesting. You don't hear that. That's not mentioned many other places, that's how close his relationship with God. God was willing to let him know what things were going on. Abraham was willing to do the things God
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so let me ask you the question. How do we have this relationship where, how did he get this relationship where he's described as being a friend to God? How would you answer that?
Well, I think it's just daily making sure that you communicate and spend time with God.
Yeah.
Build that type of relationship.
Yeah.
Recognizing how God is interacting in your life and making sure He knows that you're appreciative.
Yeah. And again, remember, this isn't in Joshua 24, in verse number 1, when Joshua, he gathers the people, and then in verse 2, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. He's coming out of polytheism. He's coming out of this paganism, right? And he is trusting God as he is called by God. And so there's something very important to keep in mind, that his faith is something that is continually growing. One commentary said in that section where his father lived, they worshiped the moon god. And so there's something to be said here as well with Abraham listening to the voice of God. And there's something to be said here about faith, about Abraham being separated from his family so that this faithful family can begin. And all of this takes faith. And Abraham's going to be tested. That's what we see in Genesis chapter 22. Not tested to sin, but his faith becoming strong in testing. This is something all of us are going to have to experience in our life. Our faith is going to become stronger in the midst of trials and tests. We can't have this idea that, well, I just want everything to be nice and comfortable and a little, a little bubble, and think our faith is going to grow. that's not what we see with Abraham. And so his faith becomes strong over these decades of walking with God. He's cut off from support of his country, of his family, and the only one that he can trust now is the Lord. That's the only one he can trust. And so we have the same call as well, to travel from the land of our birth to a land to be revealed. That's like Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to a new land. We have a new destination. And that requires separation from the world, separation from sin, leaving behind idols as well. So with the rest of our time, I want to just share some thoughts as well. Let's turn over to Genesis chapter 17 here. There's a lot to be said, obviously, in chapters 12 through 17. We can't overlook that. What we see in those chapters, and we've already touched on this, we see this journey of faith. I mentioned this last week. God is going to remind Abraham quite a bit about the promises that he has for him. You see an establishment of a covenant, or this agreement in Genesis chapter 15 as he walks through these animals that have been cut in half. You see Sarah and Hagar in chapter 16 having doubts about how this is going to work out, to the point that they take things into their own hands, and that creates more problems as well. I find it interesting at the end of chapter 16 and verse number 16, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him, and now in chapter 17 he's 99 years old. And so things are moving slow, and yet things are moving fast. If you look at chapter 17, again, what God is doing, he's reminding Abraham about the covenant that he is going to establish with him. Chapter 17, we get the sign of the covenant, the sign of circumcision. And at the age of 99, Abraham is going to be circumcised, and he's going to circumcise Ishmael as well in verse number 26. And so again, we have another example of God renewing his covenant, giving his covenant, the sign of the covenant, Abraham responding with obedience to these instructions. We also see something else with respect to Abraham in Genesis 17 and verse 17. Well, he falls on his face and he laughs. He laughs after God tells him all these things, and Sarah does the same thing. And then Isaac, his name means, he laughs. There's joy, but there's doubt, like, how is this going to work out? This is not feasible to be called a daddy with Sarah at the age of 100 years old. And so God has to renew or remind him of this covenant again. And so Abraham is continuing to walk by faith. In Genesis chapter 18, you really need to read both of those, chapter 18 and 19, together. You have these three men who appear at the house of Abraham and Sarah. And if you look at Genesis 19 and verse number 1, it's a continuation from chapter 18. And it says, now the two angels came to Sodom. So two of those men were angelic beings. They were angels. And the other one appeared to be the Lord. He's described as the Lord. And he's going to communicate things to Abraham. And so this is a section here of chapter 18 and 19 where, again, what is reminded to Abraham? Well, this time, it's another reminder for Sarah. Sarah's going to have a son. Sarah's listening to this in chapter 18 and verse number 10. She laughs as well. Verse 12, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? I think that's talking about the physical relationship between the two of them. She denies that she laughs, and no, you did laugh. And we learned something about God in verse 14. There's nothing too hard for the Lord. And the rest of this chapter now is with respect to Sodom and Gomorrah. Introduced to Sodom back in chapter 13 and chapter 14. And what Abraham's going to do, as I mentioned earlier, he's going to try to bargain or, petition God. Take note of verse 20 in chapter 18. The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. Everything that happens in chapter 19 is because of sin, all right? And so that has to define how we understand chapter 19. There are books and commentaries and things like that. The sinful behavior was the behavior of homosexuality in Genesis chapter 19. And that's what we see when we get to this chapter where Lot, he has taken up residence here in Sodom and Gomorrah. There's really one verse. Let's see here, verse 2. No, verse 3. And he urged them strongly, these two angels, to come and stay with him. Verse 4, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them. I'm reading from the New American Translation. It's the idea of intercourse, all right, or know them. Kind of the same word, I think, in Genesis chapter 5. Adam knew his wife, Eve, all right? And so the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is not due to, lack of hospitality, as some argue. It's due to the sexual immorality, and this sin has come up before God. And so judgment is going to come against Sodom and Gomorrah. Some believe that Sodom and Gomorrah would have been, or this place that was destroyed would have been near the southern end of the Dead Sea as well. There are some other really terrible things too. Lot says, I have 2 daughters. Do whatever you want with them, right? That's pretty bad too. But nonetheless, it's helping us to see that this was something that was sinful in nature. Something else here, you have violence, you have sexual immorality, and then Lot's wife is going to become a pillar of salt. Salt was thrown out, or a site would be covered with salt, or some kind of salt would be left behind to condemn it to a perpetual barrenness and desolation. So that certainly is language of judgment that has come upon this place. And there was also judgment that came upon Lot's wife. Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, Matthew, you help me to remember, I think it's Luke 17, remember Lot's wife. So this is a historical event that took place as well. We've already touched on some of the sinful behavior and really the poor things that happened as a result of Lot's decision-making as well. Chapter 20, and let me just move my slides here. Give me 1 second here. Yeah.
I listened to this book by an archaeologist who actually thinks he found Sodom east of the Jordan River, so more like, my mind failed me, but not at the bottom. And the evidence that he found for it, they unburied this town from the right time period because it had the right pottery from the right time, from the time of Abraham. And what they found was this glass-like structure that they have only ever seen out in New Mexico, where they tested the nuclear weapons, that if they hadn't flipped it over and saw this pottery from this age, they would have said, where did you get this glass from New Mexico? And so they literally think that it looks like the fire that God rained down out of heaven was the intensity of a nuclear bomb that he set off.
Yeah.
And that's the physical evidence that they found in this map.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, again, it shows the power of God. And also, I think it's important for us to think of, with Sodom and Gomorrah, we do see the mercy of God. If there were 50 righteous, he would have spared them, and all the way down to 10 that were righteous. So we have 2 minutes left here, and obviously some more ground to cover, but a lot of things have already been said. When I think about Abraham, I'll wrap it up here. There's a lot of lessons, not just individually, but even when you think about parents with Abraham, or parenting with Abraham. We have a parenting session coming up in February. What did Abraham want for his son, Isaac? He wanted a woman, from their home, not a Canaanite, right? Not to intermarry. He knows what's going to essentially happen in the process of time. And think about how far Abraham went for his servant to find his son the right kind of spouse. There's something to be said there where Abraham is thinking ahead. Abraham had vision. Abraham left behind a legacy for Isaac and also for his grandchildren, for them to follow as well. Then my last thought, and then we'll wrap up here, is take comfort, I think, in the story of Abraham. Our faith and our journey of faith, it really is a journey. This is over a long period of time when he's called, seeing his faith grow and mature. And let's get to that point where God is not going to ask us to sacrifice or kill our children, but you know what he does ask us? He asks us to put Jesus first above family, above father and mother, above husband and wife. Are we willing to do that? Well, Abraham was in Genesis chapter 22. That's the kind of faith that we must have to be pleasing to God and to go to that next land that awaits us. So we'll stop here. If you have questions afterward, please let me know. Thank you very much.